Expedition 44. We are on a series on atonement, and we have done an introduction, and we also did a first film, which we would say is foundational to everything. Matt, what did that talk about?
Yeah, sacrifices. We looked at the 5 sacrifices in Leviticus, and looked at, did God need blood to forgive?
Yeah.
And we saw that he didn't. That it was really God allowed sacrifices in that ancient culture as a way to express religious allegiance and devotion to him.
Now, in many ways, that first film is paramount to the entire series, and that's why we started with it first. If you don't get that one, and that's why we said it's really like a 3-day film. When you watch that, you got to sit down, you got to hit pause, you got to read all through all this stuff, because if you don't get that, you really don't connect the rest. Now, today we're doing what's called the Exodus, and most people know the Exodus well. They know the story of the freedom of God's people out of Egypt and things like that, but what they don't recognize is that that is a theme or a motive for the rest of Scripture, and particularly the cross. And so that's where it ties into atonement. And this is actually very simple. Almost everybody understands what the Exodus is, whether they've watched an animated movie on it or the old school Charlton Heston thing. But most people have a pretty good understanding of Exodus, but they don't have a good understanding of why it's important and how it's going to build the framework for nearly all the Bible. We see this explained from the very first story in the Bible of Eden all the way to Revelation. And so it's absolutely paramount, and some people get part of it, like they'll describe it as perhaps an Old Testament shadow, or look at Christ kind of going back and making references, circular references, but they don't really have the theological framework right to make the full connection on everything. So today I could probably explain this whole film in about 30 seconds, but what we need to do is walk through it. Matt and I, what we like to do is not leave one rock uncovered, and so this one is going to be a little bit methodical in nature. We're just going to kind of work through a lot, and in a lot of our films we say things that are just groundbreaking. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people email and go, that like totally changed my worldview or my thought or something. I'm not sure that today's film is going to rock your world that way, but I will say that every little piece of this, once you see it, it's kind of like the Deuteronomy 32 worldview.
It's everywhere.
Once you see it, it's everywhere. You can't not see it anymore. And so this is going to make some really strong connections for the way that you view other theology. And that's where we said in the introduction that so much of this, well, I hear people talk about the Exodus and talk about their view of atonement, and they don't make sense together. And that doesn't work theologically. And so today is really important to kind of build the framework for a really strong theological picture of how you see Jesus and the cross and atonement. So where are we going?
So Jesus was crucified during Passover, and so that's the big thing. So we need to connect, what does Passover mean, what does the Exodus mean, and then connect that to the cross. So if Jesus is specifically saying, all right, I'm giving myself over to the powers and going to be crucified during Passover, Passover has the most meaning for the cross. So if you don't understand that, then you're not going to understand this. Jesus is described in the Bible as the Lamb of God and our Passover Lamb. So we need to see what it's communicating about his death and resurrection. And
so when we read the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, we need to know how to better interpret that phrase. And the problem is that through the years that has been interpreted very poorly. And so today we're going to see what's a better interpretation for the way that we look at that through the death and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, so usually, and in the previous videos, we try not to throw too many stones at penal substitution, but you and I both see that they distort this view a little bit and don't actually minimize the Exodus view when it comes to the cross, when it was Jesus' major motif. And so some things we need to look at here as we're going through this, think, is there wrath or appeasement involved in the Exodus? Is there a purchase of forgiveness involved in the Exodus? Is there any debt or legal transaction in the Exodus? And who is God acting upon here? Is he getting is he venting out his rage or wrath against people, or is it something to deal with the powers?
So we use terminology of the Exodus all the time. In fact, I'm going to say, as you're looking at these atonement theories, we're going to look at the parting of the sea, and we've got PSA, substitution, debt theories, ransom theories on this side, and then you have more of the Christus Victor theories on the other side that are kind of packaged together. And so as we're kind of looking at those on this side, this is the one we have the harder time with. And so as we're not throwing stones at it, that's where we see the most problems. And so we're going to kind of make some references to that side. And then on the Christus Victor side, I mean, today's discussion, it's not really about a particular ransom theory, but you're going to see the Christus Victor model throughout today's discussion.
Yep, so we need to begin today with looking at exile thinking. You alluded to it a little bit ago. We talked about it in our first episode. So the exile and the Exodus have a lot to do with each other. Yeah. And so we look at the garden. Adam and Eve were exiled out of the garden because they ate from the tree, usurped God's authority, listened to the serpent. Yeah. But remember,
this whole Nahash thing going on. Is that the devil? Is it not the devil? Is it a precursor for powers of evil? I mean, we've talked about all those things before, but the important thing is it's exile.
Yeah, and when we look at that whole exile thing, God's promise of the exile of humanity from his presence was in Genesis 3:15, where it talks about that the snake will bite the heel, but you will crush the head type thing. And it's not about payment, but defeat of the powers. And we talked about that a little bit last week.
Yeah. So when we get to the story of the Exodus, I think most listeners understand what we mean by a Deuteronomy 32 view, but that was the idea that there were lots of gods that were kind of ruling different groups of people, that God gave them over to that, and at some point they all fell, they all rebelled. And so this story of Exodus is about God pulling his people out of that world of rebellion, crossing into a new life, a new picture of freedom with him. And this is going to be the framework for later regaining all those nations that had been lost.
All right, so let's start by getting into the Exodus. We kind of gave a big picture there with exile, but specifically we're going to focus in on the book of Exodus here.
Yeah, I call this the cosmic battle.
Yeah, so we're probably familiar with Exodus, where God calls Moses to free the people, to stand up to Pharaoh, set the Hebrews free, and there are 10 plagues, and each of these plagues was a judgment on an Egyptian god, essentially. So it's a cosmic battle going on here.
Now we're going to do a lot of reading, and you'll notice in some of the other Exodus Expedition 44 Exodus 44 films, that would have been good too.
Yeah.
You're going to notice that we write all the Bible verses on here for you to follow along. This whole series, we're not doing that because I'm trying to encourage you to get the Bible in front of you.
Have it in front of you as you're
listening.
Read
for yourself, highlight, work, get parallel translations. I hope you have our video on this screen where you're pushing pause. Hopefully you have a 2-screen setup on your computer. The next screen, you're available to look up different parallel references and things like that. You got the real deal Bible here, and maybe if you're that far along the way, you even have some kind of version of Hebrew in front of you.
Yep. So let's read a little bit of Exodus 12 to 13. We'll look at, all right, so what's this whole, the last plague? This is what you're talking about here. So the same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both of the people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on your houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I shall pass over it. And no destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt.
Now, this is one of those verses that I get to, and we always want, in our Western thinking, we don't think of these gods as real gods. We want to write them off as they were, fictitious pieces of, imagination back then. They're like our TV idols today and things like that. When at some point, you're going to have to come to reality. These were the real deal. These were spiritual powers. They were little g gods that ruled over people. And they were probably very real. Now, some of it might have been imaginative gods that the Egyptians dreamed up. If they saw this god, there must be another god. So let's just talk about some of these gods. Who were they that were being referenced to?
All right, so we got 10 plagues, and these 10 plagues associate with different gods in Egypt. So we got the Nile turned to blood, and that's Hapi. He's basically the bull god, the god of the Nile.
And a lot of these gods are going to carry for generations and generations. So this isn't just Exodus or Babylonia or Egypt or anything like that, but particularly this god and a lot of the other ones are going to find their way into a Greco-Roman mindset, and that's why this Exodus motif is still important during that Greco-Roman time period.
Yeah, we also have Isis, who is the god of the Nile. Next is the frogs, plague of the frogs, and we got Heket, which is the goddess of birth, the god of fertility, and we see the frogs went everywhere, so it's like basically saying, hey, your goddess might give the ability for birth, but now it can't control the multiplying.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that this god is going to be one that's associated with the resurrection of the dead. This is really important to the Egyptians at this time, because we think of pyramids and what they're doing with the dead, and that those people that were gods believed that if they made the cut, so to speak, that they might actually become a god themselves. And this is the god that was going to be responsible for that kind of judgment, deciding whether they made the cut or not.
Yeah, and then the next was Set, the god of the desert storms. And they said the gnats were like that of a desert storm coming upon them. So next was flies, and that's Ra, the sun god. So, and then there was Utishit, which I don't know if I pronounced that right, but
this is Egyptian. We're not really
Egyptian guys, but the head of that one represented, it's represented sometimes in hieroglyphics as a fly, that god. So.
Now, one thing, I wish we could really stop and spend like a whole film on each one of these, because again, this whole series, we're saying it's going to be the longest series we ever done, and it could have easily been 2 or 3 times as long as it is. I mean, we could have done a film a week for a year on this, and so I hope you're stopping and slowing down and getting the references here.
Michael Heiser taught through the book of Exodus on his Naked Bible podcast, and he goes through each of these when he's going through the plagues, so that's another good reference that you guys can go look at. Next one was the death of the livestock, and that's Hathor, the goddess that had a cow head, and Apis was the bull god, and it symboled fertility as well. But they all die. Then we got boils. That's Sekhmet, who's the goddess over disease, and Sunu, which is the pestilence god. Isis is also the healing god. So we got all of this going against
who's being healed and who's not being healed. That's important.
Then we got Hail as the next plague. We got Nut, the sky goddess, and Osiris, which is the goddess of crops and fertility. Set, the god of the desert storms. So we have all of the storm god, the sky god, the crops and fertility. We saw the hail wiped out a lot of this stuff. All of that is
women, childbirth, all that stuff. So what I hope you're getting here is that throughout these 10 plagues, each one of the 10 plagues was really about cosmic spiritual warfare. Every single one of them, it was about God saying that I'm in control and I'm more powerful than this little God. That I am, we're going to get to this language, Elion, the Most High, that I am the God of gods. Why do we sing that all the time? We sing that in our songs, that God Most High, God over gods, and do you really believe that? I say
lift you higher, stuff like that. So darkness, we got Ra, the sun god, which was the chief god there to the Egyptians. And then we got the last one, which was the death of the firstborn. So we got Min, who is the god of reproduction. We talked about Heket, Isis, and even Pharaoh was considered a god, and so Pharaoh's firstborn son would have been the predecessor, and so that's almost like killing a god. So when we talk about Passover, you'll remember that, the blood over the doorposts and things like that. What exactly is going on there? We want to read this, and we read it as this thing of just the people not getting killed, or the death, but there's a lot more. This is a spiritual war that's in transaction. So let's just read a little bit of Exodus 12. So the Lord said... This is Exodus 12, 1 through 11. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this is the month that will be the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man should take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share it with the nearest neighbor. Having taken into account the number of people that there are, you are to determine the amount of the lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be a year-old male without defect. You may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then you take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they will eat the lambs. That same night that they are to eat the meat roasted over fire, along with bitter herbs. Make bread without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled, but roasted over a fire, with its heads, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If something is left until morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, and your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover.
Now, we always look at history unfold, and we kind of get into this weird idea of how much does God know in foresight, how much was planned out, did he know this is going to happen? So we get this picture of the angel of death passing over, and this is where, you know, you see Moses going to his people, and they don't have a lot of trust in Moses right now, and he's saying, put this over there. And at this point, we want to read this as salvation, and it's not there yet. This is a precursor to what we want to put as salvation. So this is more of him saying, who is your allegiance going to be to? And this really gets into this good news theories. We've made films on the good news, and salvific thinking is momentary, being wrong, that it's more of a journey. And this, I just want to take a second to reedify that in this story, that, you know, this isn't salvation for the Jews, for the Hebrews at this point. This is a precursor to that. So what it's saying is Moses is saying, draw your line here. And he's kind of using a threatening thing of saying, if you don't draw your line, you're going to lose life here. Make a decision of, do you want life with the God of gods, or do you want to stay in your old world? And what we know of is almost everybody, whether they were scared into it or not, they're going to put the blood over their doorpost, because they're drawing the line of allegiance. They're saying, we need what God Most High has, and we believe that he is in our good. Now, I get back to the foresight, the predestination, all this kind of stuff coming into play here. This is a spiritual war. Could it be that this was supposed to have been the only spiritual war? Like we call it the angel of death, but that was probably a whole multitude of a spiritual force that came in amongst these rebellious gods. And could it have just happened right there and they left? Well, we kind of get that picture in the story that it should have been as easy as that, but then it continues with the plagues and everything else.
Yep. So what do we see here in this passage? We see that they take care of a lamb for 4 days. It's without defect, whereas even when they kill it and eat it, they're supposed to have no broken bones. They use the blood on the doors. Do we see any wrath, purchase, or payment here? Ryan?
I don't see any of that.
No, maybe wrath against the gods, but not against people.
And it is true that almost every time we're always debunking wrath theories. And throughout the Bible, we really never get this picture of this angry, wrathful God, you know, outpouring on people. It's almost always on things or entities, or 90% of the time, I might even say, on these fallen spiritual beings.
Yep. So the firstborn of Egypt dies. Why?
If you remember earlier, the Egyptians kill the firstborn male.
Yeah, of the Israelites, so the Hebrews. So it's not exactly retribution, but it's kind of mercy. God could have killed all the Egyptians here.
Yeah.
He could have wiped them all out because they're all under these spiritual beings.
And we get this twice. So the first time is when he just passes over and kills the firstborn. But the second time is in what we refer to as the Red Sea. We'll get to that. When the Egyptian army is destroyed. Now, God could have, if he did those two things, he easily could have just completely wiped out Egypt, like he did Sodom and Gomorrah, and, you know, later Canaan, which kind of was Sodom and Gomorrah, and things like that. We get these words of utter destruction when we get there. He's not there yet, so you need to view this as mercy. Now, he does kind of eventually get there, where he's not going to put up with it anymore, but this is like where he's giving the Egyptians time after time, even though they're not his people. He wants to regain them later, but right now, we still see mercy also to what would be the other people that are affected by this. The war is against the spiritual powers, and if the people side with the spiritual powers, there's going to be death that comes out of that. But if they don't side with the powers, there's mercy. So it's a picture at the very beginning that there still might have been mercy to those that were unclear, that didn't want to side with Egypt. That
take that into your theory of hell.
Would have left with the Hebrews, and later could they be regained into that kingdom? Perhaps. That's a lot of thinking.
Yep. All right, so let's move into the sea crossing. So the crossing of the Red Sea is another important air-quoted Red Sea there, so we're going to get into that. Exodus 15 contains the Song of the Sea. Miriam leads the nation in a song of God's deliverance from their enemies. It's after they get through the sea. So Exodus 15, Ryan, is the oldest text that we have in the Bible, along with Deuteronomy 32. They're in this kind of Paleo-Hebrew.
Yeah, so Hebrew is difficult by itself. And, I spent about 6 years studying Hebrew, and I still feel like I know about this much of it. And so Deuteronomy 32 is going to be very similar to several, I'd say some text in Isaiah 1. There's also some other ones in there where it's written in this style that we don't really have a good handle on. And what's hard is, even though I would say they are some of the oldest texts we have, they're still not, we like to use this word, original manuscripts. And it's kind of a joke to the scholars because we really don't have any original manuscripts. There's a few in, the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's pretty much understood that everything we have is a copy of a copy of a copy.
It's more of a tradition.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And when you go back to this, into Mosaic period thinking, these are oral traditions passed on. And so most people are surprised that they think that we have these writings that are 4,000 BC, and we really have very little bits and pieces, if even that. The majority of what we have isn't until much later into really Exile second period thinking.
Yeah, so part of the problem in terms of interpreting this text here in Exodus 15, so the sea crossing, is that in our contemporary world, almost all literature of the time that we study in the West is devoted completely to historical concerns and not so much of theological concerns. They always ask, did the Exodus happen? Was there really a Moses? What year did it happen? Who is the Pharaoh?
Right.
Where did it happen? What body of water did they cross?
So Matt and I have this saying that a lot of other scholars have kind of given, and we've taken and perceived it, that the Bible is not trying to teach history. It's not trying to be a science book. It's not even trying to be a math book or anything else. It's concerned with God's story to the people that he wants to get. Now, if it was going to write on everything, it would have been much bigger than it is. And the simple picture is kind of need to know. I've mentioned this several times, that even what we have that's important, like the final picture, a recreated heaven and earth and spiritual, that we become those finished works. I'm not convinced that this sanctification work isn't done until that final stage. We talk about salvation. When does that happen? I don't know. Maybe it's not fully culminated until the very end. It's hard to say.
Yeah, so that whole view of basically reading science, and it wasn't until the 19th century that history became a science. So for so much of the history of the world, history wasn't viewed as a science, and we try to read this Enlightenment worldview back into the text, and really a non-Israelite worldview and theology is what the text cared about, and not so much modern science history, not concordism.
So in terms of context, we need to read for the major view of the context. We always say this, that people build these crazy doctrines out of something this big that was a completely minor part of this. Stick to the majors and you'll end up in the right place. So even though the Bible is true, don't get me wrong, it is true about history and science. We found that over and over, archaeologically, and then in science I've made lots of references. That's part of the whole circumcision thing, is this was God's ideal, one, because it worked in science. And we found that out thousands of years later. Why did God suggest that they get circumcised and do it this way? Because it was in a polygamous culture. They knew there were going to be STDs, even though they didn't know what that meant. And God was saying, purity, righteousness.
So let's get into the Red Sea. It wasn't called the Red Sea.
Why do we call it the Red Sea? That's interesting.
So when the Greeks started calling it the Red Sea, or the Septuagint. So when the Septuagint was, and since we talked about this is such ancient Hebrew, they look at this and they're like, ask, like, what body of water is this? And you're like, oh, it's the Red Sea.
So all this stuff is going to be happening at the beginning of the Second Temple period.
Yeah.
So we're kind of looking at I would say this starts about 400 BC. That Septuagint is usually kind of, closely modeled closer to 200 BC. So that 200 to 400 period, everything's coming together. And so the people are kind of released out of this exile. They're invited to come back and to build temples and do that. So we have this huge building of sacred texts and a lot of writing going on and things like that. So we want to know the way that they're thinking.
Yeah, so when they're translating this, especially if you go to like when King James is translated, they're looking back at the Latin, they're looking at the Greek, and they're like, oh, it must be the Red Sea, but because it's so ancient, they didn't have like a grasp on this style of Hebrew. We've learned more since then, and we've also learned more about Egyptian. If we look at this just in terms of colors, and you look at Egyptian texts, they didn't refer to it as the Red Sea.
It's actually green.
Yeah, they said all the big bodies of water were the big green.
Yeah.
So the great green would have been the Mediterranean Sea, and that. So it's Yam Suf, which it really means the Sea of Reeds. Yeah. And that's usually what you'll hear, which isn't wrong necessarily, but
and it actually had more of a had a more of a meaning of the end. And this is really kind of important when you look at the Red Sea.
Yeah,
because,
in Egyptian.
Yeah. So even before all of this happened, there was a connotation with the sea that this was the border, this was the extremity, this was the ending place, and that was a reference kind of to life. Now we don't know if the Egyptian rulers were saying this so they would kind of make these borders sacred.
Yeah.
That's important to see sacred borders here of kind of instilling in the people, don't leave our borders or death will come to you.
We even see that in Hebrew thought, the borders of the camp and what dwelt outside in the desert and north. The theological, the space of north to Egypt was where the evil powers resided.
Go down and minister to these people, and
north.
Go north, and you're really going down. How does that work?
East is another one.
We'll get that one. Don't go east. That's bad.
East. So let's get into kind of crossing the sea. We see that actually, like, the Red Sea should be the Reed Sea or the Border Sea. So it's more not talking about an actual. I mean, it was an actual body of water, but the theological meaning of it was the place where you exit. Basically.
Now, this is important. Don't get us wrong here. We're not even touching whether the Red Sea is this sea or not. It probably was.
It might have been,
we don't have a big problem with people that say that. But what we're trying to do is get back to what we know. This is what biblical theology is all about. We don't want to call it the modern day Red Sea that we know of and get that into our mindset because we don't have that. We want to go with what we have.
Yep. All right. So the crossing of the sea. So when we think of the crossing of the sea, we have what you alluded to earlier: two pictures in our heads, either Charlton Heston or the Prince of Egypt. Yeah. So those are the two things, the animated show. Yeah. So and when we think of that, what we see the picture of in Exodus 15 is the Lord winning this huge battle. Right. So we have him defeating the armies and the gods and all of this stuff. But when we actually see what's happening in the text, it's Israel running away from an army chasing after him. It doesn't look like this great battle that's being won by them or God. It seems like they're running scared.
So this is very interesting. If you were to go back in time and ask the Egyptians if Moses was going to rescue them, what would a good rescue look like? They would probably say, well, we want to learn to fight. We want to defeat Egypt and everything else. And it's not, they do defeat Egypt, but not the way they thought they were going to defeat Egypt. Hold on to that thought for a while.
Yeah, so Exodus 15:6 says this. So it says, your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy.
Who was the Egyptian enemy?
Yeah, so the god of war in Egypt was the god of Montu. Montu is sort of an aspect of Ra. It was his right hand, his god of war.
So this is the sun god. Now, an often reference in Egyptian culture is that this was the God Most High. Now, you're gonna gravitate towards that because when we talk about the God Most High, we talk about Elyon. And so when we go to Egypt and the Egyptians think that they have this great god Ra, the whole story is God saying, Ra is not the most
Yeah.
high God, but I am the most high God. I am Elyon.
So in the Egyptian point of view, Ra's mighty right hand was Montu, and that's what he was called. Well, he was this god of war, but it's saying that the Egyptians' god of war, the high god's basically hitman, was destroyed by Yahweh.
So in every god that we see, and this is why we started describing the gods, that in every god we see, God Most High is going to say, but I'm better than that. But I'm better than that. But I'm better. And I'm going to defeat them and show you that there's no question to be had here.
Yeah, so even the pharaohs after this, there was would take kind of like middle names.
Yeah.
And Strong Arm, or Horus the Strong Arm was one of them that we had. And what basically the biblical writers are doing is using this strong arm language and applying it to Yahweh as divine smack talk against Egypt.
Now this is interesting. We always go back to these writers. Is this, how much did God give them and how much were they just writing? But the thing that I want you to get is when we read this, and I'll have Matt read Ezekiel here, the writers were, as he said, it's smack talk. They're raising up. It's a form of honoring God Most High over the rest of the gods and saying they're nothing compared to our God.
Yeah, and even centuries or many years later, Ezekiel chapter 30, verse 21, it says, "Son of man, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh in Egypt." And he goes on to saying that with his mighty right arm, or the sovereign Lord has basically destroyed them. So he's still using this divine smack talk years later. The right arm broken means you can't hold a sword, you can't make war. This is about war against the gods and their defeat, that they can't even make war against Yahweh anymore.
Yeah, so let's get back to the Red Sea. When we mention the Red Sea, we kind of mentioned that they were in Egyptian culture, they were kind of told don't cross here, you might receive death or something like that. So I'm sure that when the Israelites got to this body of water, there was like this tremor going on of like, are we going to die? What's going to happen? Are the gods going to come strike us down? But what do we see there?
So in the pyramid texts in Egypt, you'll see this river Styx. And it's a body of water to them, which was on the border. It's the border between life and death. And so what this represented in kind of their mythology is when they would die, they would have to cross this body of water, and they had all these prayers and incantations that would allow the gods and this person to cross over the river into a shadowy existence with their gods.
And they didn't even really know what this was.
Yeah.
And so there, whenever you read these ancient Egyptian texts, again, we've got about as much of this as we have of the original Bible stuff. It's just not there. So we're reading, copies of copies of copies and things. But what it seems like is they didn't have a good handle on this. They had some idea of afterlife, and that's why we see pyramids in Egypt, and we see them thinking that if they were great rulers, they may become a god, but they didn't know what happened to everybody else. Did they go over to the sea and they were judged here, and some fell into the sea? So there's actually, if you read a lot of these ancient things, some of the Israelites probably would have been concerned that there were actually spirits of the dead in that sea.
And so you get this this phrase in these Egyptian texts called the Makeu. That means the drowned ones. And so what happens here is those who didn't make it across to an existence with the gods would be the drowned ones. It's kind of basically the damned, the ones in hell in Egyptian thought. And so here, what's happening in the crossing of the Red Sea, when Pharaoh and his army get drowned, they become the Makeu.
So this is kind of interesting because we get like the Johnny Depp movie kind of about the old, sea things and stuff like that. And that's
Davy Jones' locker.
That's kind of like where this comes from, is these those that don't make it. And so there's all kinds of old Egyptian lore that goes along with this. And again, we could spend tons of videos just on this. But the important thing is this sea signified something spiritual. It signified some kind of a delineation of life. Would you go on and become a god, so to speak, or god-like, or would you simply go into the earth never to be heard before, become the damned army or whatever it might be?
So the ones who were guided safely to the other side wasn't through the incantations or anything of the gods of Egypt. It was Yahweh himself bringing them through the Red Sea, and they didn't even have to, I guess, make it to the shadowy existence, God splits the sea and they walk right through. So when we talk about Passover and communion, it's all about the passing from life to death. And that's what we see here. It's not really an allegorical thing. What they're saying here about the sea is that literally in Jesus, it's a Passover. It's they travel through death. It's not so much that it's like, it's the celebration of Passover all over in here.
So you're making connections along the way. In fact, you'll see Matt and I smirking all the time because it's like, we're saying this because we understand that this has huge implications later on in the story. And so, like when we were explaining the passing of life, what you're going to find is that, the Exodus motive is passing through the sea. You're putting all the old gods behind. It's a victory over them. You're leaving them. You're watching them get expunged into the sea, and you have new life, new covenant in communion.
Yep. All right. So, like as Westerners, we kind of miss all these connections and trying to prove history, and we miss all these theological connections, which are so important to our view of the cross.
Exactly. Yes.
All right. So let's look at Passover. When they're in the land, God has some instructions for the Passover sacrifice. So let's dig into that just quickly and before we move into the New Testament.
So this is Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 7.
Yep, so observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, because in the month of Aviv he brought you out of Egypt by night. Sacrifice is the Passover to the Lord your God, an animal from your flock or herd at the place the Lord will choose for the dwelling of his name. Do not eat it with bread made from yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste. So all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt. Let no yeast be found in your possession in all the land for 7 days. Do not let any of the meat you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain until morning. You must not sacrifice the Passover in any town the Lord your God gives you, except the place he chooses for the dwelling of his name. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Egypt. Roast it and eat it at the place the Lord your God will choose. In the morning return to your tents. For 6 days eat unleavened bread. On the seventh day hold an assembly to the Lord your God and do no work.
It's important to read that. Read it a couple times. Hit pause right now and just go over that a little bit, because this is pretty instrumental. Now, we started off explaining the sacrifices and kind of putting them in different, classifications. So when you read this is, I'm going to call this a well-being offering. And in our Western mindset, we get this wrong. We think that we're asking for forgiveness for each thing that we did, and that's not what it is. And so it's really more of this going back to the Exodus motive. It's allegiance. It's that first step. This isn't salvation. This is just saying, think today, who is your allegiance going to be with? And if your allegiance is going to be to God, and God delivers you, then we need to say thank you for those things that are going. And unfortunately, this is the way that most of our prayers work. They're 95%, thank you, thank you, thank you. And there's nothing wrong with that. But back in Old Testament offering, which is going to translate into New Testament prayer life, there's a lot more to it than that.
All right, so there's one other interesting story here in the Old Testament, and then we'll kind of summarize a little bit and then move into the New Testament. 2 Chronicles 30, 13 to 20. A very large crowd assembled in Jerusalem to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread in the second month. They removed the altars in Jerusalem and cleared away the incense altars and threw them into the Kidron Valley. They slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. The priests and the Levites were ashamed and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the temple of the Lord. Remember, that's the offering just to meet with the Lord. It wasn't about forgiveness of sins or anything. It was just, hey, we want to spend some time with you. Then they took up the regular positions as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. The priests splashed against the altar the blood handed to them by the Levites. Since many in the crowd had not consecrated themselves, the Levites had to kill the Passover lambs for all those who were not ceremonially clean and could not consecrate their lambs to the Lord. Although most of the people who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun had not purified themselves, they ate the Passover contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, "May the Lord, who is good, pardon everyone who sets their hearts on seeking God. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, even if they are not clean according to the rules of the sanctuary. And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people.
All right. This is what I would call a minor text. When you were in grade school and Sunday school, this is one that you probably got to. And okay, we're just going to skip over to the next chapter. Why are these in our Bible? These are really important. In fact, some of the minor texts that we have, oftentimes, we're not majoring on the minors, but the minor texts are going to give us a lot of definition into the majors. And so you probably never slowly read this, and I'm going to say pause the film again and read it over and over, because boy, if it doesn't have implications on other theology, Matt was joking about hell earlier, and this one's right there again. And so what are these saying contrary to what people usually think? People have these preconceived notions of, wrath and things like that, and what's required before God, and this one kind of smashes all those theories.
Yep, so what we have here is the people repented of their idolatry. That's what starts with. They were unclean but celebrated the Passover as commanded.
Yeah, so God's going to say celebrate this, and there's all these rituals for cleanliness. They
don't have time to do them.
Chapters and chapters of do this, and all of a sudden God just says, just forget it. I just want you to come to me.
Yeah, and we see the sacrifice here wasn't about forgiveness, appeasement, or averting wrath. It's the burnt offering, so it's just about coming before the Lord. Right. God, I want to spend some time. Here's a reciprocal gift.
Relationship. Heart.
Yeah. So they asked God to pardon the ones whose hearts were set on the Lord, and it wasn't connected to sacrifice at all.
Yeah. So I hope you're getting all this. I hope you're reading in between the lines here, but all of these doctrines now that are set on, your forgiveness, your repentance is linked to sacrifice, blood, salvation, all this stuff. We have this very vivid picture, and God goes, that's not it. Don't go there.
So the Lord heard them and healed the people.
Yeah.
And then we got to look, all right, so forgiveness isn't connected to sacrifice. It seems like it's connected to repentance.
Yeah. So keep all those things in there, kind of package them up. We're moving through all of this as we get to some other ideas. And again, I'll just go back to where we started this film. None of this is necessarily groundbreaking. Oh my goodness, I never read that before. That's going to change my life tomorrow. But it influences so much of your theology in other places.
Yep, so let's recap Exodus and Passover, and we'll move into some New Testament stuff then.
Judgment on the powers. That's where I always start. There's this cosmic battle of the powers going on, and that's, if you don't get that as the major thing that's happening in Exodus, you miss it. And when it's a major theme in the first Exodus, and every time we start to read other Exodus pictures throughout later Old Testament and New Testament, guess what? Our mind should go right back to that and say, if we see any kind of Exodus theme or motive, what are they saying? They're talking about the cosmic battle of powers.
Yep, so as released from slavery, from the powers, you see that the judgment was on the gods to release them. Though it was Egypt, they always saw in the biblical spiritual worldview, there's powers behind the people. Our fight isn't against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers, as Paul says.
And I've mentioned before, we don't see any debt or sin language, and so those kind of ransom, debts, all this stuff, PSA language over there, they're not going to find, if you think this way, if you go back and really research the Exodus, those atonement theories are going to be very difficult to find within this Old Testament.
Yeah, so it says God purchases a people, and the way he purchases them is by releasing his people from slavery. There's no price being paid there. He calls them his sons and daughters. So it's not a purchase or a legal metaphor. It's a rescue.
It's a rescue, and it's a healing metaphor. And so later in the New Testament, what are we seeing Jesus? Jesus is defined as, the doctor, the healer of life, the healer of relationships.
The great physician.
That's what we see here in the Old Testament. They work so tight together. So to do something other than that, whether you're using legal or debt or whatever, it doesn't fit the narrative of the Old Testament Exodus, and it really doesn't fit the narrative of the New Testament when all the references are circular to the way they saw the Old Testament.
Yeah, so Passover sacrifices were a community meal, so think communion.
Yeah,
so
communion meal
and celebrated being rescued.
And again, we're not just responsible for ourselves. Matt and I are in this together. we just don't think that way today.
And notice when we go back to the lamb there that was slaughtered, it wasn't one lamb for every person.
Yeah.
It was a lamb if there was enough to go. If you didn't have enough to go around, invite your friends over.
Yeah.
So the one lamb covered a whole household and maybe multiple households.
And that's really, it's communal thinking from the beginning. When they're raising this lamb, it wasn't just, I'm making a 4-H project of this beautiful lamb. This is like, hey, we're getting our small group together and we're going to win the small group prize, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, like this is, we're all in this together.
Yep. So 2 big key things for Exodus is its rescue from death and its deliverance from slavery.
Absolutely.
So those are the 2 big key things.
So I think it's time. We've been alluding and hinting to New Testament thoughts and things like that, and I think it's time to get there. But we're really going to just dwell on what the New Testament Bible says.
Yep.
But I'm really tempted to make 4 more films about all the Second Temple stuff, because if you watch our films at all, you're going to know that we think Second Temple literature is paramount.
It's important.
We don't think that it's inspired, so to speak, but our version of inspired might be different than your version of inspired. But we do think it's important. It's what the people of the day were thinking, the ideas they were coming up with. And so when you read a lot of that Second Temple stuff, now again, this is generations and generations after Exodus. Guess what a huge part of that theme, their writing is about?
They're looking for another Exodus.
They're looking for another Exodus. And so
Deliverance
we get
from
this.
exile, powers.
It's Apocrypha. You know, we read the Apocrypha, and we have Psalm 17, we have Second Maccabees, we have Baruch. I'm just, almost every book in the Apocrypha
has Exodus themes.
Leans into that. Now, we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff for a long time, but upon its discovery, one of the first things when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls is it went, how old are these? Because they keep talking about
the Exodus.
The Exodus, you know? And so, you know, I could name these. You get 4Q 252, 4Q 554, 4Q 434. I could probably just do 4Q and 3 numbers, and it would have an Exodus theme in it because it's all over it.
Yeah, Book of Jubilees, it's all over there.
Yeah.
So,
Treatise on the Saints is also going to have that. We're going to have the words of the luminaries. We're gonna just the Testament of Levi. Yeah, that's an important one.
All of those Exodus themes all over.
Anytime you see the name Enoch, now this is really crazy because Enoch at this point is going to be old, and we have all these stories on Enoch. Yet when they talk about Enoch, you're going to see themes of the Exodus.
And deliverance from the powers.
How do those 2 things fit? That's what everybody was thinking. So if their framework in Second Temple was that way, starting 300-400 years before Jesus, going into 100-300 years after Jesus, and all the writings were saying Exodus, 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 why don't we think this way?
Yeah. So if it was in the water there, it obviously is in the mindset of the New Testament authors.
Yes.
Because they were in this culture.
Yeah.
So.
And they would have assumed that. Mm-hmm. So I think in the first few centuries when they're reading the New Testament, the assumptions are there, but we don't read in our Western mindset today with those same assumptions.
Yeah. So Second Temple Jews, like you said, had this motif of that. And so what they thought of was deliverance in the New Testament from the powers of Rome and from their enemies. And when Jesus came, it didn't quite look like what they thought.
So I alluded to this.
Yeah.
You know, what did the Egyptians probably want? They wanted to actually go kill, you know, the Hebrews wanted to go kill the Egyptians themselves. They wanted to become this great army. But God does the battling for him. And we always say, what is God's ideal? Matt and I are pretty firm believers that in almost every story of the Old Testament, God's people actually weren't supposed to do anything. They were
just supposed to let God do it.
They weren't supposed to go to war. They weren't supposed to train. They were basically just to go pray, offer altars and things like that. And God was supposed to go before them and do the work. We get that picture of the first Exodus, that God did it all for them. Why would we think later in 1st and 2nd Kings that God would want the people to fight those battles? And then later, when we get into the Messiah coming, we see the same theme. People are looking for this militant takeover that they want to fight, and God says, I'm actually going to do this on my own, through my own powers, and I would actually just like you guys to step aside and be faithful.
Yep. So let's get into some of the Gospels. And we'll get into this more a few videos down the road. We got Day of Atonement next, and then Isaiah 53 before we get into what does Jesus say about his own. So we'll get into this a little more.
I'll just put a little preference here, too, that the timing of these things is important. In the next film, we're going to talk more about timing, but a lot of people today are going to put Jesus, the last dinner that Jesus is having a Passover meal with his disciples. Matt and I don't view it that way. Matt and I see Jesus as the Passover dinner. And so this is a little bit of a controversial point, but a lot of the things that we're going to allude to or make references both in this film and the next film are going to point to that. We're not trying to necessarily like throw it back in anybody's face. We're just saying that when we read the Bible, this is the way we see it.
So when Jesus kicks off his ministry in Luke chapter 4, 17 to 20, goes, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, to recover sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolls up the scroll and says, "This is fulfilled in your midst." So Jesus' whole mission is Exodus themed, release of prisoners.
And when you say Exodus theme, what are you talking about? You're talking about freedom and deliverance. And so as Egypt left the slavery situation that they were in, they were given freedom, they were given deliverance, they were given some kind of a framework for a love relationship with this God. And as we get into, let's reveal the word new Exodus. We're going to get into this new Exodus with Jesus, which is going to establish a new covenant, and we're going to see those exact same themes carry true.
So let's go to the Last Supper. We were just talking about that a little bit. We got Luke 22, Matthew 26, Mark 14. You can also go 1 Corinthians 11.
They're all connected.
You can kind of read all about that. But historically, we believe it was similar to a Seder meal, but it wasn't exactly a Seder meal. There were 4 cups.
Now, this is what I always say in Hebrew. We want to go back and we want to celebrate these feasts exactly on the days that they were. And that's not the Hebrew way of thinking. Now, there were some things that were very precise, like when you celebrated a Passover meal, it was all supposed to be cleaned up before the next day. That's going to be important later when we get to it. So there were things that were spelled out like that. So that particular one was in part because they didn't want these to turn into drunken festivals. And so there's a lot of reasoning going on to that, but some things are precise, but the majority of them are actually not very precise. And so, these, like a traditional Seder meal we think of, sometimes those are started a long time before. It's kind of like if you're going to a music festival and you say, well, I want to go 2 days before and set up my camp and hang out with my friends and things like that. Some of the best music festivals, the pre-parties are better than the actual party, and that's a Hebraic way of thinking. That this isn't just one day. This is I'm all in here, and that's really the mindset that if you were all in, the timing doesn't so much matter because your regular life doesn't differentiate from the time that you're going to church, so to speak. And that's also in our lives the way it should be. Too many of us go to church on Sundays and live differently the rest of the days, and from the old Exodus narrative theme to the new covenant, that's still the mindset of get out of that Western way of thinking. Don't just go to church on Sundays. You're with me all the time in everything that you do.
So at a typical Seder dinner, you'd have 4 cups. And Jesus says that he won't drink the last cup until he comes into his kingdom. So most people likely think that it was the 3rd cup that Jesus did. And all of these coincide with the 4 I will statements that God makes in the Exodus. So the first cup is a cup of sanctification. That's I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. The second cup is judgment. I will deliver you from their bondage. And the 3rd cup is the one that most people think that he drank is I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Remember that mighty right arm thing with great judgments.
So are you guys seeing the connection? We have this Exodus story of the Egyptians and Hebrews being delivered, and then when it comes to Jesus, he's redoing this again. And again, in
judgment on the powers.
In first, second generations of after Jesus, they would have just got this. They just would have read it and go, oh yeah, that's Exodus theme, But But today we kind of lose that importance in it, and we need to regain it.
Yeah, so that third cup was about deliverance and judgment on the powers.
Yeah.
Not on people. So
what's the fourth cup that you said wasn't
Yeah,
may
the
not
cup
have
of
been...
praise. I will take you for my people, and I'll be your God. This probably talks more about the second coming.
Yeah.
So, all right. So then communion also celebrates the new covenant that was told by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31. So 31 through 34 in Jeremiah says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord. I'll make a new covenant with my people, the people of Israel, with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel at that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my laws in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I'll forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more." Talking about the end of exile there.
So this is Jeremiah kind of prophetically looking forward, and what they're looking for is an end of exile. Now, by the time Jeremiah writes this, they've kind of already experienced a little shadow of the end of exile. But you can see from an Israelite's mindset, it hasn't culminated yet. And even today, if you talk to a traditional Jew, they're not sure that they're out of exile today.
Yeah.
That's an argument.
So we got, in this passage, connecting it to the Last Supper, we got 12 disciples representing the 12 tribes.
This is remnants.
Yep.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, the end of exile, or the exile to the powers. The new covenants connected to the Exodus there. And so, when we remember...
Now, it's important when you say that, too. So there's a connection, but Jesus tends to take what's in the Old Testament and kind of build on it. I don't like to call it further revelation, because I don't see that it's changed.
No.
I see that it's just, taking the same themes and carrying those things over to branch from Old Covenant to New Covenant thinking, but a lot of it is the same, and that's important to note that that's what's going on here, too.
Yeah, so let's look at Passover and Exodus a little bit in the book of John. So the Gospel of John, we have Jesus declared as the Lamb of God by John the Baptist at the beginning, and then at the end we see him crucified during Passover, and that's in John chapter 19.
Yeah.
And
bookends.
So the bookends there connect the Exodus theme in John. So some connections in John here is Jesus was crucified while the lambs are being slaughtered, and we see that in John 18:28, 19:14, a few other verses.
There's also that reference I made earlier that we're going to get to this, that the Passover meal was supposed to be finished, and you'll notice that Jesus was removed from the cross in this kind of expedient manner, and that lines up with that.
Next thing is Jesus' body was not allowed to stay on the cross until morning, just as the Passover meal wasn't allowed to remain until the next day. We talked about that.
Drunken festival.
So the next is the presence of the hyssop branch that spread the blood on the doorways during the Passover.
This is probably my favorite one.
So they used a hyssop branch with the sponge with the wine and vinegar on the cross, and this is a picture that on the cross, Jesus' blood was shed, but the cross was the doorpost for the world.
That's important. So you have the doorpost of if you want to take the first step of allegiance, and again, I go back to this is not salvific yet. It's going to get there, but if you want to make a proclamation, this is where it's done through Jesus on the cross.
Jesus' legs weren't broken. We see the other criminals' ones were, just as the Passover lamb was not to have any broken bones.
So that's unusual. When you go back and you look at people that were, crucified, their bones are broken almost every time. In fact, I'm not sure that you could find another instance of somebody's bones that weren't broken on the cross.
So the blood of the lamb ransomed the firstborn of Israel from death, and Jesus' blood ransoms us or rescues us from death. So don't think rap here.
You say ransom. What does that mean?
Well, we'll get into this a little more when we look at what Jesus says about him being a ransom for many. But the ransom here, God is said to ransom Israel, but was there any price paid in the Exodus? No. His ransom was his mighty right arm smashing the powers.
So at the beginning of the film, we said, do we believe in ransom theory? There's a ransom theory of atonement. We just don't necessarily believe with what the ransom theory of atonement says. But we believe that there was a ransom. We just see it differently than what really that theory usually says.
So when we look at the Exodus and God says he ransoms his people, there was no price paid. God's ransom was smashing the enemy so his people could go free. So that was the ransom. It wasn't a price. It was God's action of deliverance. So Jesus' death is seen as a departure and a defeat of the powers, especially in in his resurrection as a new Exodus. So
this is cool because you have Eden, and when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the cosmic sanctuary, God still says, "I'm going to come amongst you and bring that sacrificed atonement to you through being together." Later, I was kind of alluding to that's going to come into Jesus' atonement, but this is the plan to regain what was lost in Eden. In fact, I say this all the time. The entire story of the Bible is what we're reading of God's regaining plan. So Genesis 1 through 3, we have what was lost, and the rest of the Bible, we have the story of how it's regained.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even after Jesus is resurrected, Mary thinks that Jesus was the gardener.
Yes.
So the new Adam.
New Adam theology, the gardener. I love that.
So let's look at the Exodus and Paul a little bit. Romans 5 through 8 specifically talks about
this. Is another one we could do a whole film or two or three or four on.
Yeah, so Romans 5 talks about us being under the power of sin, a power of death, and that's like the new Pharaoh.
Yeah.
So we're all taken by this power of death. Jesus frees us from death, delivers us. That's the Passover lamb type.
And then you get into Romans 6, and Romans 6 is all about baptism.
Going through the Red Sea.
Yeah.
So it's about a departure from the powers and into God's rule.
Yep.
Romans 7...
Allegiant thinking again.
Yeah. Romans 7 talks about the law was powerless to deal with sin and powers.
So how many times have you guys read Romans 5 to 8, and you've probably never seen all this Exodus theme, and you won't be able to read it again and not get that. So now... pause the film and go read Romans. In fact, just read the whole book. And you're going to get it all over. You're going to go, how did I not get this before? It's all over the book.
Yep, and then Romans 8 begins with Jesus defeating sin. And it talks about the Spirit conforming us to Christ's likeness that brings us into new creation.
Right. Now, some people want to see this. Some people read this as Jesus being punished by sin.
No, it's defeating sin in his flesh.
Yeah.
It's the strong arm motif again.
Yes.
So that's kind of a quick recap of Romans 5 through 8, which is a whole Exodus theme.
Yeah.
N.T. Wright's written more on this. And Cynthia Kazimoff.
That's what I'm saying. Like film after film, we could break up so much of this, but we're just going to leave it there.
So Colossians 1, 12 to 14 says, "And giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people into the kingdom of light. For he has rescued you from the domain of darkness and brought you into the kingdom of the Son he loves, whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins."
We're getting to the point of the film where we hardly have to explain these because we just read them and you're going, oh my goodness, like there it is.
So we have redemption language, and that's language used in the Exodus. We have rescue from dark powers, forgiveness of sins, which is the end of exile, and inheritance, which is coming... God's giving us.
Now, this is where at the beginning of the film I said Matt and I kind of lean towards a little bit of a Christus Victor. But we're going to find a lot of truth in a lot of these. In fact, I even was throwing stones at ransom, but we believe in ransom theory.
When properly defined.
We properly defined. And so we're going to take all of them. It's kind of that Scott McKnight golf club theory that we might not see the ransom theory the way the rest of the world sees ransom theory, but we're going to take parts of that ransom theory. But the majority of Exodus... And this is where Matt might feel a little bit differently than me, but I'm strongly rooted as a Christus Victor person being paramount on this. And then everything else kind of supportive of that.
Galatians chapter 4, we got some more. So we were underage. We were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. When the time... had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship, because you are his sons. God sent his Spirit to his Son, into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and since you are a child, God has made you an heir.
Again, we hardly have to define this. We've got this redemption language, we got slavery, child language going on there. It just screams Exodus.
1 Corinthians 5, 7 to 8. "Get rid of the old yeast, that you might be new unleavened batch, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth."
So delivery from the slavery, the powers again is paramount here, a new way of living, new covenant.
1 Peter 1, 18 to 21. For you know that it is not with perishable things such as silver and gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you by your ancestors, but by the precious blood of Jesus, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who was raised from the dead, and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God.
Now this one we get a little stronger language here than the other one. So we have the redemption Exodus language going on, but there's even more. This kind of has some references to the blood over the doorposts.
Yep, Jesus is a lamb without blemish or defect. That's the Passover lamb.
And the important thing to get out of here is resurrection is about deliverance of that death. It's kind of the crossing over of the sea of deliverance.
Yep, so it's got echoes that. We get more of it in 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy.
This is one of what I think is one of the most paramount verses in the entire New Testament, or sections of verses in the entire New Testament. Yeah. It talks about who we are, and I don't preach very often, but the last time I preached, this is what I preached on, is that we are today sacred priests in that calling. That Adam and Eve, the ideal way was that they were to be set apart as priests, and in a new covenant thinking, that's who we are to this dark world.
Yep, so as a result of Exodus, we're set apart, we're freed, and we're kingdom of priests. That's all language if you go read the Exodus.
Light, darkness,
Yeah, God wanted Israel to be a whole kingdom of priests.
Yeah.
So we've been rescued from darkness.
Did God punish Jesus? That's one of the things that flushes out here.
Yeah, no, we don't see it at all. so
we're just set free from slavery. That's it. There's no punishment of Jesus going on or anything else.
So Revelation, let's look at that just a little bit. So in Revelation chapter 5, it talks about the Lamb who was slain with his blood he purchased a people for God. This is Exodus language. Remember, there was no actual purchasing going on in the Exodus, like no money being exchanged or God paying off the devil or Jesus paying off God on the cross. The purchase is not about a legal function, but it's about release from slavery. Like we said, the purchase was actually, the ransom was the smashing of the powers.
No, throughout Revelation, if you go back and read the whole book, and you're going to just have to read the whole Bible, I think, after this one, but you go back and read Revelation, there is so much Exodus motif going on here, but we're going to kind of just talk about Revelation 15 and 21, because if you followed our eschatology series, those are two very important chapters on it. So what do those two kind of talk about, and where's the connection?
Yeah, so Revelation 15, the church sings the song of Moses.
Yes.
So, and of the Lamb, for it's the deliverance from the nations and the powers behind those nations.
And there's a whole study in the Alpha and Omega thing going on, too, that, this is all circular. We talk about this a lot, that, this story of Moses, the Song of Moses, is one of the most complex things we have, one of the oldest things we have. And it's one of the last things talked about in Revelation of going into a recreated new heaven and earth. And so we see this theme again from Eve until the end of recreated heaven and earth. I'm sorry, Eden. To the recreated heaven and earth of that we're seeing the entire Exodus motif first, and then repeated in Jesus, and then a little bit of that is going to be
new creation.
Yep.
So that's kind of a snapshot of most of the New Testament, and there's more that we could go into in that, but that's just kind of a bird's eye view.
So we've gone through a lot. We've kind of, like we always say, haven't left any rock uncovered. We've talked through all these things, and I'm just going to go back to where we started. Like, none of this is necessarily going to change your life, but it's going to change the way that you view the rest of the Bible, your interpretation, your lens, things like that. So let's just, in a nutshell, kind of go through and just kind of bullet point the journey that we've been on, because it's really easy to not remember the important things that happen, because we've talked about a lot. So we're just going to kind of go through this last part of the film and tell you what's important about what we touched on today.
Yep, so Exodus is simply about rescue from death and deliverance from slavery.
Keep it simple.
Yep, that's simple. 2 points.
Yep.
Death, slavery. So the language of redemption, rescue, ransom are all words that are directly connected to Exodus, which mean deliverance, but not punishment.
Yeah.
So we're rescued from the powers, and we're rescued from sin. We're not rescued from God.
Good. And so, we kind of get that with the wrath language too. The same thing going on.
Yeah. Yep. So the purpose of the rescue is to create a kingdom of priests. So remember in our first episode we talked about sin and the image of God, and it brings us back to our original purpose, and that's the rescue.
And up until this point, if you lived in Egypt, you might feel like there is no one true God, that the world is captivated by these fallen deities, these fallen gods, and so this is a reemergence of God taking his rightful place in the world,
and
reclaiming what was his.
Yeah, forgiveness language that's involved here and in the New Testament is about deliverance from exile. So the original Adamic exile and the Jewish exile in that context of basically being diaspora, stuff like that. So,
what about debt language? We've covered that several times in here.
Have we seen any? Is
No.
there the language of purchase? Jesus giving up his life has to be interpreted through the Exodus motif.
The only debt we get here is that we are giving our lives to this story because Jesus is rescuing us from the death and from the powers.
Yeah, so because he's rescued us, we owe our lives to him.
Yeah. So in terms of debt, that's really all we see in the Bible. You know, there really isn't more. And so whenever you get into these theories that really build on debt, be careful.
So there's no appeasement or legal language in the picture of the Exodus at all.
There's all kinds of healing language, but not legal language.
So if you want to get picky, there isn't even an act of atonement being spoken of in Exodus.
Yeah.
So if you look at specifically talked about the kapar words a little bit.
Purging,
last week it talked about purging or covering. You could say that the powers being defeated, that they've been wiped out, covered, dissolved, I guess you'd say, their power removed. So that's kind of in that ballpark, but the overall picture isn't dealing with morality and forgiveness. It's being rescued and us being restored to what we were created to be, a kingdom of priests.
So this is really important because, again, you're going to start seeing some of these atonement theories build on things that in the Old Testament they just weren't there. And if you sit in the New Testament, you take little words and pull them out here and there, and it doesn't go back to the big picture of what the Exodus theory was, it doesn't match. And that, again, theologically, that just doesn't work, and you're going to be having to do all kinds of gymnastics to try to make it work. And a lot of the people that hold these views or these camps have this huge separation of the Old Testament and the New Testament. They almost write off the Old Testament as this just ancient babble, you know, and where Matt and I go, oh no, they're very strongly related and tied into each other.
Yeah, so since Jesus' primary motif here for communicating his crucifixion was the Exodus, that should be our primary metaphor for thinking about the cross and its effects. So I think we can chalk one up here for Christus Victor.
Yeah, definitely. So what Matt is really kind of saying here is that when you go into any kind of atonement theory, you have to bring in the foundation for atonement theories, which was in the Exodus. So when you view a new atonement theory, you should be viewing it through the lens of Exodus. If it's screaming, as we showed in the New Testament, they're saying this is Exodus, Exodus, Exodus. They're linked, they're shadows. There might be a little building on that as Jesus is going to perfect the Old Testament, but it circularly goes back, and both of them are going to signify or reiterate the other one, and we can't lose that. If we disconnect them, we've lost the overall lens or message that was intended to have been received by the believers and to go into the new covenant.
All right. So next time we're going to look at the Day of Atonement. Jesus didn't die on the Day of Atonement, but we see...
That's that timeline thing we're going to talk about.
We see Jesus fulfilling the Day of Atonement through his death. So it's not as prominent as the Exodus themes, but there's a few connections in the New Testament, so it's worth looking at. And you'll be surprised kind of how much overlap there is with today's topic of the Exodus.
I don't know that it's going to seem like we're having the same video, but there's going to be a lot of repetitive thinking. But I would say at this point in the film, this is only the introduction, film number 1. This is 2.
2, yep.
And we're probably going to end up with 12 or 15. I don't know at this point. But all of them now are going to have some kind of repetitive language of the Exodus because that's what it is. So I hope you understand that. Like I said, today's a simple idea. In 30 seconds, you could just say that all the themes in the Exodus are also reiterated in Jesus
Yep.
and the Atonement. And so once you get that picture and you don't disconnect the two of them, you're going to think of atonement theories a little bit differently. May God bless you and keep you.